We are going to start this second session with Amy, who is currently a PhD student working with us in the Turbulence simulation group. And Amy is going to talk about wind turbines and about the implication of shear and thermal stratification on the wake dynamic close to the turbines. So please, Amy, you have 15 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening. So yeah, I'm talking about how shear and thermal stratification affect the near wake dynamics of a wind turbine wake. And this is work I'm doing as part of my PhD with help from Sylvain and also Yorgos Deskos. Okay, so just an overview quickly. I'm going to present the results from a set of simulations of a single wind turbine in uniform flow, flow with added shear, and flow with thermal stratification. And we're doing this with the aim of predicting when the wake will break down with these different inflow conditions, and specifically how these inflow conditions contribute to the wake breakdown. And if we can do this, we hope to use the results to improve farm layout and also optimize control strategies. So I'm looking mainly at the near wake, up to about 8 radius downstream, but especially focusing up to 3.5 radius downstream. And I'm going to show you results of the flow structure, some mean statistics, and also a bit of Fourier and POD to extract coherent structures. Okay, so wind turbines exist in the atmospheric boundary layer, and therefore they're affected by the properties of the atmospheric boundary layer, and these include the wind speed, shear, turbulence levels, wall effect, and thermal stratification. So we're going to decompose these effects just to focus on the effects from wind shear and thermal stratification. Realistic values you can expect for shear across a radius of the turbine blade are in the region of 10% for a neutral boundary layer. So this is when we can ignore temperature effects. And the shear increases up to 20% and more for stable boundary layer. And we get about 1% thermal stratification across a rotor blade. And the diagram on the right is just showing how wind turbines are increasing in size, and as they increase in size, the percentage change of these gradients is going to increase. So this work is really important to understand how these effects are changing the wake and the breakdown. Right, I'm running simulations in XCompact 3D, of course. We're using a uniform mesh domain of 10 radius cubed, and that's split into 513 nodes. So it's high resolution simulations. We have our turbine, which is modeled with the actuator line method. So approximating the blades as lines and applying a forcing term on those lines, depending on where they are located in the rotation. And it's located in the center of the domain and 2 radius downstream. I've got the implicit LES to solve for turbulence. And our base flow is a uniform inflow of 1 meter per second. And then when we have shear, we're applying it so the velocity in the center of the domain remains at 1 meter per second. And then each radius up is an extra 10%, and each radius down is minus 10%. And the thermal stratification is the same, just with 1% change across a radius distance. And yeah, so for the sake of this presentation, I'm presenting those results so you can see how adding the thermal stratification changes the effect from the shear, from just having shear. And we've got results from 600 snapshots, which are taken every 0.05 seconds. And I'm using these to compute averages and also for some POD results. Okay. The other thing we're adding in the setup is tip perturbations, and this is to trigger a breakdown into turbulence. They're harmonic perturbations, and the frequency here is really what's important. And we can define that with K, which is our dimensionless wave number. So the number of waves of the perturbation in one revolution of the turbine. And this is important because we get breakdown via the mutual inductance instability, which arises when neighboring vortices interfere with each other because they have perturbations which are out of phase. When we have in-phase perturbations, for example, if K was equal to 3, then our flow looks the exact same as the unperturbed case. So I'm not presenting that. And the amplitude is chosen, so we have a velocity perturbation of 0.005. Okay, so quickly onto some validation we did to make sure our setup was good. We're following on some research done by Kluisberg, so we copied their, we tried to see if our initial results for uniform flow and 10% shear match theirs, and we found they did. So this is the radial growth of the vortex. On the left, you've got uniform flow, and the radial growth is the same the whole way around the vortex, which you would expect. And on the right, when we have shear, the radius increases along the bottom and it decreases along the top. So our results are in blue there, and theirs are in red. Okay. Right, now on to some of the pretty pictures that we've got. So these are the 9 cases that I'm going to be talking about. So we have uniform flow, 10% shear, and then 10% shear plus this 1% velocity gradient. And you can see for the unperturbed flow along the top line, the shear has the effect of increasing the spacing of the vortices along the top and decreasing them along the bottom. And then when we have our perturbation, you can see that the wake starts to break down into turbulence, and you can then see that the shear has the effect of increasing the wake length along the top and decreasing it along the bottom. And when we have a wave number of 9/2, we have a slightly longer wake length, and hopefully the next slide will show a little bit why that's happening. But yeah, the effects from thermal stratification is not too visible with these photos, but with the next one, you should be able to see a little bit more the effect that that's having. So these are the planar vortex lines. So if we cut the vortex along the top and flatten them out, this is what it looks like. So for our unperturbed case, with uniform flow, all of our vortex lines are parallel to each other. And then when we have the shear, you can see that the vortex lines are being squashed closer together along the bottom, and they're spacing out more along the top. So that's here and here. And then you can see a bit more clearly how the thermal stratification is actually changing the structure of the vortex lines. Now here, you can see what's happening with the mutual inductance instability, which is what I was talking about earlier. So as the perturbation grows, the vortex lines, as the perturbations are out of phase with each other, the vortex lines get closer and closer together until eventually at the locations where they've got peaks and troughs, they basically interfere, and this causes breakdown into the turbulence. And with our larger wave number, so a shorter wavelength, it takes a little bit longer for this to happen because the amplitudes are a little bit smaller. And again, you can see how shear is causing breakdowns happen faster along the bottom and along the top, and the change that thermal stratification is having to the flow structure. All right, these are the mean streamwise velocity. So for our uniform, for our uniform flow, it's largely symmetrical. We do have some asymmetry with the perturbation cases, which we think is just due to how the perturbation grows. But essentially we've got symmetrical velocity. And then with our sheared cases, we have the, you can see that the center line of the wake is actually deflected downwards slightly. So this links to, this is, correlates with the fact that we had the radius growing along the bottom and smaller along the top. And with our thermal stratification, we have the wake compressing slightly and the center line kind of readjusting due to this thermal stratification. The turbulence intensity is a useful statistic to show us really exactly where the wake is breaking down at the growth of the turbulence intensity. So you can see clearly here how the shear is delaying the onset of turbulence along the top and quickening up the onset of turbulence along the bottom. And for our perturbed cases, we have that same slanting of the wake, but it's slightly more exaggerated for our number of 9/2. And our thermal stratification doesn't seem to actually change the location of the turbulence onset, but there is a slightly different structure within the wake, which is more evident towards the end of the domain. Okay. The next thing I did was a bit of Fourier analysis, which helped to see the response of the wake to the harmonic perturbations. So after finding the Fourier modes, I then collected the maximum of the modes of the first mode at each downstream location and plotted these on a log graph, and then finding the gradient of that gives us the growth of the perturbation. So on the next slide, I'll just show you what's going on there. So this is the results for our 9/2 case. And you can see that at the location of the turbine, we have a spike, which is where our forcing term is. And then we have a period of receptivity while the perturbation is not doing much. And then after that, we have a linear portion. And so on this log graph, that's an exponential growth of the perturbation. Then I've plotted the straight lines on the top of this, which I've used to actually compute the gradient of these parts. So you can see the growth rate for the uniform case here was 2.4, and then shear reduces the growth rate along the top and increases the growth rate along the bottom. And that hopefully still ties in with the fact that the wake is longer along the top than the bottom. And our thermal stratification seems like it's actually increasing the growth rate of the perturbation along the top and along the bottom. All right. So these plots are the real response of the first Fourier mode for those same three cases. And the interesting thing I think here is you can see we have this initial 6 lobes, which is what you get for the unperturbed response. But as you move downstream, these 6 lobes morph into 9 lobes. And the 9 lobes is what we expect to see for our wave number of 9/2, as each lobe is half a wavelength. So by the point that the wake has broken down, which happens between 2 and 2.5, you can see that this perturbation has developed. And then as we move further downstream, it grows in magnitude. And then for the sheared case, you can see that the growth of the perturbation happens faster along the bottom and slower along the top. And with our thermal, it looks very similar to the shear case. We have slight compression of the wake, which is evident towards the end, and the magnitude of the perturbation looks slightly larger as well. All right, the final thing I wanted to show you was the sort of initial results we're getting for POD. So I'm just going to show one case here. So we're using POD, or we're going to use POD more to extract coherent features of the flow, and it finds orthogonal modes. So we get modes arising in pairs. So I'm showing modes 3 and 4 here, so you can see how they're pairs with the same spatial structure and also the same mode energy percentage. And they're just slightly out of phase with each other. So we've got quite promising results for that. The majority of the energy of the flow is in the first, say, 6 modes. So this should give us some good data to reconstruct the flow for low order models with, say, 6 or 10 modes. And the other thing I wanted to just point out is that you can see how the perturbation mode, so again, this is with 9 lobes, becomes more dominant as we move downstream. So in the near wake, of 0.5 radius distance. We don't see these 9 lobes at all in the modes I'm showing here, but they become the 3rd and 4th mode as we get further down. And then by the point that the wake is broken up, we have our 9 lobes mode as the most dominant, so it has the most energy in the flow. Lastly, I've just got a plot of the power spectral density for this location at 2.5 R. You can see that we've got dominant frequencies for the wave number relating to 3/2, which you would hopefully expect as 4.5 is a multiple of this. We have a frequency relating to k equals 3, which is just of our unperturbed flow, and then we also have a spike for our wave number of 9/2, which is what we're perturbing here. Okay, great. So just to summarize, I've just showed the results of this investigation into how the wind turbine wake breaks down in uniform, shear, and thermal stratification. We've got harmonic perturbations, which trigger the wake breakdown when they're out of phase, so they're causing this mutual inductance instability. Shear has the effect of increasing the wake length along the top and decreasing it along the bottom. Our thermal stratification compresses the wake structure. And we can link the growth rate of the perturbations and look at Fourier and POD to actually see how these structures are affecting the location of the wake breakdown. And I'm continuing this work by going further into the POD to really see how specific locations and specific coherent structures lead to which breakdown and how they lead to the breakdown. And I'm also going to look at some different shear levels, so specifically 20% shear, and we're going to look at higher thermal stratification, potentially an unrealistic value, just to see what effect this has when it's really exaggerated. All right, thank you for listening. Let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Amy, for your nice presentation. There's a question from Flavio. Can you tell us how you are dealing in the code with the thermal stratification? Which equation you solve?
Yeah, I'm initializing it as a gradient, and then I've got boundary conditions for the top and the bottom.
Which equations do you solve for the temperature?
Which equations?
Yes.
So I'm like adding it to the flow. So yes. The temperature has been decomposed so that we're just looking at the what's it called? Fluctuation off a mean temperature profile. So I've got this temperature, the stationary temperature profile, and then we're looking at a deviation from that so that there's no error when it's put into the Poisson equation. Sorry, does that answer the question?
Well, we'll know very
so we're
soon.
just adding g theta to as a force term for the momentum equation.
Thank you. Is there any plan to compare stable versus unstable stratification?
It's definitely, we've talked about it. So I think once I have looked at all of this, it's definitely the next logical step to look at, unstable boundary layers where we'd have a slightly positive temperature gradient, and there's not much shear at all for that sort of, that sort of boundary layer.
Great. And one last question from Ubaid, and you might have to contact him after that because it's a very interesting question. Have you considered using linear stability analysis or resolvent analysis on the mean flow to see if you can predict the breakdown structures?
No, I haven't, but it would be something to look into, definitely.
I agree with that. That's a very good point. Thank you, Ubaid, for your question. Great. Thank you, Amy.